Broadcasting from the far side of Enceladus, beaming in at the speed of light across the vast chasms of space, streaming directly into your brain, you're listening to episode 21 of the Spartacast League. I am Phelan, and joining us today are Hems and a new host, Frets. So, Frets, please step aboard the mothership.
I am aboard.
All right. It's been a wild couple weeks here. First off, is everybody okay? Because I understand the last couple weeks have been a little bit traumatic for a lot of people as far as the news cycle goes.
Nothing happened that I didn't expect. None of it's good, but, outrage after outrage. And no, I'm not like becoming numb to it and saying, oh, it doesn't matter. But it's just like, I know what the state's going to do, and I expect it to do that because there's no effective resistance to it. So they're going to get away with it until we resist it.
The Kavanaugh hearing and everything was pretty traumatic for myself and who've dealt with sexual assault. That's been the most remarkable thing about this month. I had a friend describe it as triggery, and I thought that was a pretty good word.
It definitely was. It was uncomfortable to watch the entire scenario play out the way that it did, the way that the media handled it, the response afterwards from the party in power was just, it was all very disgusting. Pretty much for those that don't know, although you probably already know by now, that Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed by the Senate 50-48. The votes did spread along party lines, with Democratic Senator Joe Manchin breaking rank and file from the Democratic Party to form the majority, which, to be honest, it's Joe Manchin. God. So, nobody is surprised because this guy's, basically a Democrat in name only.
And can you believe that, Chuck Schumer said that he wasn't gonna punish any Democrat who decided to vote for, and they call themselves the Resistance. I'm honestly more disgusted and more ashamed and more outraged at the effective nothingness that the Democrats do to stop anything than I am about anything the Republicans do. Because it's expected of Republicans to do what they do.
I mean, is it not expected of the Democrats to do this? What was all of Obama's term than just the Democrats compromising in the name of political expediency and getting stuff done? So if there's civility, if there's anything that you should have learned from the Democrats from pretty much Clinton onward, or even Reagan onward, is that they don't put up a fight and they will side with whatever's expedient for them to stay in power because they don't have any values that they really hold to. They're very quick to put their finger in the wind, see which way politics is going, and then do whatever their donors pay them to do.
And that's what makes it so heartbreaking, because it'd be one thing if they, like the Republicans, were just honest and said, we're gonna screw you over all week long. And then just do it. Yep, we only stand for our donors. We don't want, minorities beat in the street, but yeah, pay them $7.25 an hour, that's fine. And then it wouldn't feel like a betrayal. But instead they get up there and they say, we're gonna change things and we're progressive, and then don't do anything.
Well, it's marketing.
Yeah, it's marketing, and that's the problem. There's no politics in it. It's not a party. It's a brand. It's not a party because there's no political ambitions, no projects, no goals. It's just what the donors want.
My biggest takeaway from watching the hearing was watching this grown man sit there and cry in front of a bunch of other grown men about how much he likes beer and how the Democrats are being mean to him and basically making all these dog whistles to conspiracies. That somehow makes him qualified to be a judge. That's really what threw me off. That was acceptable behavior to pretty much half of the Senate to say, yep, this guy's qualified, let's rubber stamp him through. Even the so-called moderate Republicans, even 10, 20 years ago, that behavior just wouldn't have flew because he would have been branded unfit to be a judge.
Well, I mean, the gloves are kind of off at this point, though, aren't they? Because the Republicans have spent the last several decades listening to conspiracy shows on right-wing radio and getting spoon-fed increasingly conspiracy-driven stories from right-wing gutter press, basically. And at this point, we have the President of the United States going up and talking about straight-up conspiracy theories. I mean, he just did it this last week with the Saudi Arabia murder. It's becoming way more normalized. That's honestly part of the scariest thing about everything that's going on right now is that, it's one thing when conspiracy theorists are kind of relegated to, YouTube and ancient aliens and stuff like that. But when these guys start getting the reins of power and start making decisions for an entire country, that's some really alarming territory.
Like, the alarms have been going off for 2 years. This is what I, like, when I said in the very beginning that I wasn't really fazed by it because I expect it, because there's no effective resistance. The actual legit, the Nazis did this too. They had their whole, weird conspiracy theory of the Aryans underground, the Tibetan mountains or whatever. Just wacko stuff. And a lot of conspiracy theories are really convenient for hiding the relationship of capital to labor. I mean, the Illuminati conspiracy theory is basically just that. There's some bunch of rich people and they want to kill us all, which is true, but you don't need, like, the secret cabal of handshakes and symbols to explain it. It's just there.
Well, the other part that misses is the fact that it's not one cohesive movement that's doing it. The bourgeoisie is broken up into various factions, and they each person within in each faction fights for their own interests and everything. So the whole idea behind, like, the Illuminati is there may even be, like, some remote truth to it and everything, and there does seem to be, like, some, like, historical something that's behind that. But the way that it's presented is so misaligned that it's to drive a narrative to a conclusion. It's not reflective of the actual truth, and it misses the whole point that it doesn't matter who in that wealthy elite or members of what group, they would act like that anyway. Like, they would do that because those things are within their interest to do them.
That's the thing. It's, conspiracy theories always seem to be wanting to sell you an answer, wanting to be selling you an easy solution to sometimes usually very complex problems. And I've noticed something about kind of the psychology of a lot of right-wing politics is, a lot of these people really are attracted to very simple answers to things that are very deep and very complex. They don't want to think about it. They think of themselves as simple people who need simple answers in some cases, like literally say that. I mean, in conversations that I've had with people, it's a marketing thing almost. I mean, people like Trump will take advantage of that. You have people who want a simple solution, and he, of course, is going to offer, whatever solution he thinks that will get him more power and more votes.
It's not like Marxism can't be made as equally simple. There's a bunch of rich people. They all want to kill us. Let's get rid of the rich people and let's own everything together.
You would think, though, that that is the answer, that they're trying to simplify it. And in some means it does simplify it. But, like, when you start really getting into conspiracies, what I really learned here is they get really intricate about it. It's a bit like Scientology. They kind of ease you in with those simple answers, and then all of a sudden it's reptilians, and it's a story about the guy, on a secret Mars base, and the aliens from Serpo. And there's
then you have to buy some brain force.
Yeah, and then you got to buy some brain force because you need that brain energy to figure all this out, because you're just spinning your wheels at this point.
It's pretty amazing how, going to use the word incestuous here, the conspiracy community is, because I find myself entertained by this stuff, and so I will, tune into Ancient Aliens once in a while just because it's entertaining. If I find something on YouTube like that, I'll kind of click through the links on it. It's remarkable because when you click into something about flat Earth it'll somehow link back to things about Hollow Earth, and I find myself going, well, how do you guys square with yourself the idea that you think the Earth is hollow and flat at the same time?
Well, there's different factions within the conspiracy community, and they all point to each other and call each other liars, frauds, charlatans,
and
hacks, and of course federal agents, because they have to be part of the controlled opposition if they don't believe the world is flat. I mean, obviously.
So is Brett Kavanaugh, honest to God, a conspiracy theorist? Or is he just playing...
He's made some allusions about the Clintons and the body count and that kind of thing. I think that he may be, but it's really hard to tell when you're dealing with people that are in that kind of position, because it's hard to tell if they actually believe it, or if they're putting on a show, or if they're doing this so that their base will support them. I would almost like to say, because it is a non-elected position and he was speaking to senators and not to the general public, that maybe he does believe this, and maybe that was his signal to the more extreme part of the Republican Party, and that's what got him through, was, making a nod to those magical phrases.
I mean, at the same time, the Republicans are trying to basically sell a brand right now. I mean, how much of that was coached by, other people from the GOP establishment? That's what I kind of find myself wondering when I was listening to that whole thing.
It definitely was amazing, amazingly depressing watching it. That's for certain. But then what came after was just like the barrage of just online harassment from the Kavanaugh bros that supported them. They went wild that night, just harassing people online, just making dicks of themselves in public, pardon the language. They were doing the okay flipping thing, beers for Brett's was a thing. All of the major right-wing accounts on Twitter were saying stuff about how they wanted to abolish women's suffrage at this point now. They want to go out and kill thoughts, which is an acronym for that hoe over there, which is kind of adjacent to the whole incel thing, but not necessarily part of it. There were allegations of Ford being part of some Semitic plot, even though she talked about Kavanaugh to her therapist in 2012. Some of the people making these comments were people like Rush V, Richard Spencer. Nick Fuentes called for Christine Ford to be put in jail. I mean, so that's who we're dealing with. These people aren't civil people.
Christine Ford, by the way, didn't come from the Democratic Party. It wasn't the Democratic Clinton conspiracy. This was a woman who had been wronged by this man and stepped up. If she hadn't done that, there would have been no resistance to it whatsoever.
Right, he would have just been rubber stamped through and nobody would have known about the entire ordeal.
But, the past 2 years have also been a history of women saying, I've been touched, I've been violated.
It's really because...
And a big fat nothing's happened.
Well, because nothing has happened, that's why women in the past really didn't do anything. If anything, this kind of goes to show that women aren't taken seriously when these allegations come forward. How many people in power actually get in trouble when these allegations come up? How long did it take Harvey Weinstein for that whole thing to unravel? I think that we're still dealing with that, if I recall correctly. The whole Jeffrey Epstein thing. And those guys were friends with the Clinton. It goes with both parties in America. Nobody's innocent when it comes to this, when it comes to Democrats and Republicans. And we need to stop pretending that that's the case, that both parties are equally culpable here. And this is a cultural issue that women aren't taken seriously when rape allegations come up.
One just pretends not to. In Arizona, running against Kristen Sinema, there was a trans Muslim woman, Deidre. And I had said on a previous show how the Democratic Party was running calls for canvassing for Sinema before the primary was even over. And so here's the most progressive person who could come along, right? The one you could really stand up and say, look who we're putting forward. And instead, they just railroad her off the tracks. And then when I get a text message saying, hey, vote for Kristen Sinema, I texted them back, how dare you? After what you did, I'd vote for anyone but. And then they pull the whole, well, there's too much at risk in this election. What would I be risking? Because you don't fight back. You don't take women seriously. You don't support their claims. You have token pieces. You move around the board. And that's all. Unless they're wealthy. And even then, only sometimes.
And then we have Hillary Clinton's most recent comments regarding Bill's allegations as well. I mean, it's just pretty staggering. I really do feel like it's kind of that rich elite against anyone who can stand up to them mentality on their end more than anything else. I don't feel like the Democrats have ever really stood for any of the progressive values that a lot of people would like to ascribe to them.
And the other thing that I also wanted to point out, did anybody hear about the case in Florida, speaking of like the celebrations and the aftermath, that this guy in Florida actually went on Facebook and said that he was ready to kill the senators that would refuse to vote in Kavanaugh? He posted that he'd purchased 12 boxes of 50 caliber hollow point bullets. And then he also made like some bizarre statement that we need more conservatives going into liberals' homes at nights and killing them in their sleep. I mean, this is where we're at in this country with the right, where they think that they can get away with making these kind of statements.
I mean, that's one of the reasons that we're talking about self-defense today, isn't it? I mean, this is getting to the point where these people are actually starting to put a lot of action behind these words, and we're seeing it more in the street, and we're seeing it in attacks and even deaths that have occurred in the last few years.
Right, and we saw it in New York just this weekend where the Proud Boys attacked protesters outside of a reenactment that Gavin McInnes did of this socialist leader. It was bizarre. So back in the 1960s, there was this leader of the Japanese Socialist Party that was assassinated on television by sword. And Gavin McInnes went on TV went to this Republican club and reenacted it in New York. And there was a protest going on to protest that whole event. And the Proud Boys, after the event happened, went out there and started beating the protester.
These videos are honestly pretty frustrating to watch. I mean, for a number of reasons. I mean, we are seeing, in a lot of cases, a complete blind eye, if not assistance, to these groups being given by the police. We are seeing a horde of violent fascist thugs taking to the streets of the country and basically being able to do whatever the hell they want. These rallies are getting increasingly violent. We're starting to see car attacks being more prevalent. Certainly, groups of people coming in, swinging and beating on people, and mass attacks like we saw with at least one of the incidents in New York, where we had how many of those guys were there? It was like 25, maybe 30 people jumping on one person. It's getting a lot scarier. In every one of these protests that I see videos of, it seems like there's a kind of a buildup happening.
It seems like every protest is getting more and more violent, it seems, at least in recent memory. This was honestly one of the worst battles, if you will, really since like the Berkeley thing was pretty big and I'd say pretty major. But it was like an oddity of that time. There were just maybe 3 incidents like that, and then they kind of stopped. And then within the last few months, it seems like these events have been, not only have they been picking up, they also got more extreme. Like, you didn't see 30 right-wingers go in there, pull somebody out of a group, and just start beating them. And really, the police, not only did they like not do anything to defend the protesters, of course, they kind of let the entire thing go down in ways essentially strategically defended them. Of course, obviously, we can't depend on the police because that's not what their job is. Their job is to protect the people in power, which in this case, that's basically people like the Proud Boys. These guys are unofficially but recognized paramilitary groups, which it wouldn't surprise me if many of the police are secretly members of as well.
Recently in the news, we had a police officer who lost his job because he was found to have obvious connections to the Proud Boys. I think that that's a lot more common than people would like to think. I mean, one of my favorite Rage songs is Killing in the Name of. I mean, he repeats that, some of those who burn, some of those who work forces are the same that burn crosses. I think that that has a long, long history. That's something that it's unfortunately hard to explain to white liberals a lot of times because people like my parents, brought me up to trust the police. And then, as I, grew up and discovered that I was gay, moved to the city, my interactions with the police got a lot more negative. I started realizing that a lot of the things that we were taught to believe in terms of what we could trust with law enforcement were not actually the case.
You'd also kind of wanted to go into what we could kind of do to defend ourselves in these kind of situations and everything, as you'd alluded to earlier.
That was kind of my whole point tonight. At least as far as what I wanted to talk about. To start off, just so that I can, let everybody know where I'm coming from. I'm not an instructor. I've taken a lot of martial arts over the course of a good number of years. I'm not particularly high ranked in any of them either, but I have a lot of experience in a lot of different areas, and I've been training for a long time.
So it wouldn't be appropriate to necessarily call you an expert, but you're a martial arts enthusiast.
I would say I would call myself a self-defense advocate.
This is branding the punch.
One of the things that I wanted to talk about is I get a lot of questions from people just because of the different numbers of martial arts that I've had experience in, and because this is a really commonly asked thing. It's like, what do I want to take if I'm going to go into martial arts? Because it's an investment of time, it's a lot of effort, and there's a lot of different arts out there that people can get into.
So, as you alluded to earlier, you are a self-defense advocate. What kind of advice, what kind of things should we be doing, you think, on the left here that would be good practice?
I have been really, really hammering home with people in my local community and just anybody who I can get to listen, basically, that we should be taking responsibility for our own safety. This goes down to some really, really core principles that are very important to my own leftism, if you want to call it that. But I think that when it comes down to it, we need to not rely so much on any of the established law enforcement or military or any of that stuff that tends not to work out very well in our favor when things get rolling into a fascist regime.
Right, and that's because, of course, the law doesn't really side with the people, especially if they're leftists in this case. The law is acting to defend the interests of the propertied and of the moneyed, and to keep the working class kind of servile to those needs.
Right, exactly. And the thing is that even if you wanted to buy the complete liberal byline of, cops are trustworthy and, we should be honoring them and trusting them with our safety, when it comes down to it, in a lot of cases, the cops are pretty much there to investigate after the crime has occurred. And so unless your partner has already been killed by somebody, or unless you have been stabbed or you have been physically harmed, there's not really a whole lot that the cops can do. An interesting anecdote that I have for this was actually a number of months ago. My partner was walking to a convenience store that was in our neighborhood and came back in tears, crying, collapsed on the floor when they got inside. It took me a while before I was able to get the story out. Finally, when they were able to get around and actually tell me what happened, they said that there were 3 grown men that were standing at a bus stop near this convenience store who basically threatened to kill him. The thing was that we did call the police on this, and when the police arrived, they basically looked at me and said, well, these people have freedom of speech, literally used those words, and basically proceeded to do absolutely nothing that night.
Which is interesting because technically that is not covered under freedom of speech. If you threaten somebody, that's actually against the law.
That doesn't matter if the cops who end up taking that call aren't willing to actually proceed with that.
If you want to take that liberal line of, the cops being good and everything, if you want to take that, then there's also the whole Supreme Court case. But there's been multiple cases where it has been determined that the police actually don't have to intervene during a crime. They actually have no duty to actually protect. So the whole protect and serve thing is just a slogan. There's no legal weight behind that. They could sit there and watch a crime occur and then do the investigation afterwards, and they're still legally in the right here. They don't have any obligation to actually help you, assuming that they could even get to you in time, because 911, you call that and you don't know when they're going to show up. So self-defense is important for multiple reasons. So even if you were to believe, the cops are good, and which they're not, there's still so many different angles involved here that show that self-defense is still critically important. And as people on the left, because people on the left are generally more vulnerable to others, because the left has a lot of people that are racial minorities, that are LGBTQ individuals, etc., that are singled out for hate crimes.
Right, and becoming even more so as this current crisis that we're dealing with kind of unfolds. We're dealing with people, I don't know if you watched Tiny's, one of Tiny's latest videos, but these guys are really out there to hurt you. They're not really going to be beholden to any sort of code of honor that anybody might think that they are. They're there to hurt you, and they're there to pick off the people who they think are going to be easy targets. I mean, we see that in these videos. If they see somebody who's straggling behind in a line, they'll grab them and they'll start beating the crap out of them. That's the kind of person who we're dealing with, and who may be posing a threat to us on our own streets. There have been a number of stories here locally in Seattle. There was a really high-profile one a while back where somebody was leaving Trans Pride and ended up just getting the snot knocked out of them. They almost died from this attack. There's pictures of them with their face all bloody. This just happened because they happened to be walking alone on a street, after Pride.
The leader of the Proud Boys, Gavin McInnes, he went on Joe Rogan and talked about his group, the Proud Boys. He admitted that it was a gang on the show, and he admitted that it was violent, and that was the point of it. And he's quoted multiple times on his podcast saying to go out there and start fights among leftists. If you see a leftist out on the street, beat the shit out of him, as he said. Like, he literally said that on his podcast. He encouraged people to go out there and choke transgendered people, although he didn't use that term. He used the slur. He literally vulgarly described how to do it. The process of like crushing the windpipe, that kind of, it was disturbing. And the fact that he can go on this podcast and he can say this to thousands of people, and there is no FBI investigation of the Proud Boys to my knowledge. They're not labeled a terrorist group. It's Antifa that apparently are labeled the domestic terrorists. That goes to show what side the government, what side the police, when they defend these people, what side they're on.
Absolutely. Let's be honest. I mean, when Trump won the election, we knew what direction this was going to go. And it was probably around like 2015. I had taken a break from my training for a good number of years. Long story short, I'm a craftsman by trade, and so my hands are very important. And I made a decision a long time ago that I would need to make a choice between the martial arts that I was doing and the craft work that I was doing. And the craft work, because that was the thing that was lucrative, ended up winning. When 2015 rolled around and that campaign cycle really got rolling, I decided that it was probably going to be worth the broken fingers if I was going to be able to protect myself and then the people that I really care about. Those instances were going to probably become more and more common as this thing got rolling. Just historically, this sort of street violence is a thing that, comes hand in hand with fascism.
As far as techniques, things that people should know, what useful weapons that people should have, what would you recommend for somebody to actually go out and get started and kind of go down this path that they wanted to be able to defend themselves against the right?
Sure. Yeah, and I can't go into talking about any particular maneuvers or anything. And even if I could, a show this length would not be long enough. And also, there's a visual aspect of a lot of this stuff that would really need to be there. Just for those of you who might take that visual aspect comment to also mean YouTube, there's also a teaching aspect. There's a lot of subtlety to some of these things that really needs to be explained by somebody who's been trained well and knows what they're doing in order for these things to be properly taught. In terms of what I would recommend, one of the more common questions that I get asked is, what sort of martial art do I want to get into? What's gonna actually help me? I would say that most martial arts can be categorized into 3 different groups. There are a sporting variety. Those would be sort of the martial arts that you see in an MMA ring. They are the kind of thing that there are, literal sporting competitions built around. Things like Taekwondo, things like Judo, that you tend to see in the Olympics, that are mainly meant as kind of a sport. The type that I would say after that, there's an internal sort of martial art and a meditative martial art. Things like Bagua, things like certain styles and methods of doing Tai Chi that are not necessarily meant for combative or sporting, but they're meant to train, they're meant to do other things. The type that I mainly wanted to talk about today is the third variety, which is combative arts. And those are kind of set aside in my mind as something that people would want to get into, simply because the focus of a combative art isn't to go into a sporting ring where you're worried about a sparring partner. It's not about doing slow meditative movements that are not necessarily going to help you in a fight. Combative arts are about typically using the simplest means possible to incapacitate an opponent.
So in other words, basically you would be recommending something that is efficient, that you're not going to do a lot of actual maneuvering to get the job done.
Typically, I would almost say, as just a kind of a rule of thumb, that if something looks complicated and kind of overly so, that it's probably not the best thing to be doing in a given situation. In terms of styles that I like, that I just recommend off the top of my head, that are what I would consider to be combative styles, Wing Chun is currently the system that I study, and I'm a little bit of a Wing Chun supremacist. I think that there are things that really do set that system apart from a lot of others that make it very, very effective. There's a little bit of a learning curve with it. It's a Kung Fu style. It's got a little bit of subtlety to it, but there are a number of things about it that make it very, very effective. Other styles that I like are Krav. One of my training partners also trains in Krav, and that stuff just seems really brutally effective to me. From everything that I've seen on it, I'm pretty impressed. If you have the flexibility and don't mind getting into doing high kicks and stuff, Muay Thai is really nasty. That's an art that if you get good with it, it's really easy to use that and really.
So what it sounds like is that we need to maybe get leftists together and just like form some dojos or something like that.
That's what I was going to ask, because we're all poor wage workers, right? And even if we could afford to go out and get the lessons for the, $300 a month or however much they are, it's probably going to be in a really gross, toxic environment that isn't conducive to saying, oh, well, what if a fascist attacks? Because it feels like kind of the same thing as the gun culture too, right? Like it locks us all out because of its toxic culture around.
That's a pretty big concern, and that's something that comes up an awful lot when I've tried having these conversations with people. There's a bit of a nonviolent streak in a lot of leftism that I'm basically going to blame on the hippies in the 60s. That wasn't part of leftism in the early 20th century, where we did embrace guns, where we did embrace actually taking a lot of direct action. But some of that is left behind, and we are also dealing with communities full of people that have trauma too, and that can come into play. Not everybody is capable of just walking into a dojo, and having people put their hands on them in some cases where this is required for doing the maneuvers. My partner is one of these. As much as I've tried to teach my partner, some basic martial arts, there's some PTSD stuff that tends to come up in those instances that's made that very, very difficult to pull off. I mean, I myself am not necessarily free of any of those kinds of issues too, but I do push through them in order to get the training that I think is going to be useful. And the toxic atmosphere is definitely a thing that you can encounter, and that's a very important thing to consider when choosing a school. Most schools will actually let you come and sit in on classes, and what I would recommend to people looking for a school is actually go and check them out. Just ask if you can come in and you can watch a class, see the way that they train, see the way that the instructor handles students, see what kind of students are in that class, and really kind of get a sense of it. You may be able to do that a couple times with even a given class, and check out everything that's in your area, because some of those schools are going to have drastically different cultures than others, and some of them are going to be much more healthy to train in, and some of them are just going to be really toxic. And yeah, absolutely, that's a thing to look for with training partners on an individual basis. It's a thing to look for in instructors, and it's a thing to look for in schools.
But it definitely is something that the left does need to get serious about, is that this is life or death. We're rapidly approaching a point where it's not political theater anymore. This is real. This is happening in the streets every day. It's happening more often. The right's becoming more emboldened. They feel that they got a right to do this. They have the means to do it. The law's going to cover it up for them so that maybe nobody finds out about it, or if they do, who's going to do anything about it? And they got they got the police, they got the judges on their side. So it's life or death for a lot of people, especially if you're in a vulnerable position. And it's something that you should highly consider. And maybe if you can't do martial arts, concealed carry.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a thing that I probably don't make any friends, really pushing this issue, but I really do feel an obligation to talk about it because, I have been myself in a number of very dangerous situations. I won't go into it, here because it's not necessarily important to the conversation, but I've had a number of things happen to me over the years that really kind of cemented that idea that when it really comes down to it, it's really, you only have yourself to rely on. I mean, when I talk with my partner about, wanting them to get into training, I'll say, I'm not always going to be there. I'm not always going to be there. You're not always going to be in a group of people who can help you. And it really does come down to whatever you can do to keep yourself safe, to keep your loved ones safe. Honestly, if you have people that you care about, if you have loved ones, if you have family, if you have, a husband, wife who's living with you, this kind of gets into some really yucky territory, but it's kind of hard to avoid that. But how are you going to feel if that person ends up hurt or killed and you were there and you could have done something, but you didn't know how?
Right. There's a lot of elements to this, and people need to understand, you only live once, that we know of anyway. So, if they
can literally just back this all up by saying YOLO.
Yeah. I was thinking that same
Punch
thing.
Nazis, YOLO.
Yeah, YOLO. You only live once.
I'm making that a shirt now. Punch Nazis, YOLO.
I'd buy that shirt. Something else to consider too. I can't remember who it was, but somebody made an excellent Twitter post a while back that I wish I could have reblogged a million times, because the person basically said, have you trained today? Because a Nazi did. That's another big thing that I think about, is that groups like the Proud Boys are almost set up as, personal training groups. I don't know if, many of the listeners actually understand what goes on with the Proud Boys. I mean, Gavin McInnes just, kind of laid it out pretty plainly in that recent interview. But what they do is they get together and they drink together. They build camaraderie between each other. They learn about the people who they're going to the protests with, which is very important. It's very important to understand who you're standing next to at one of these protests.
Exactly. It works very much like a military organization. These people, the way that this pretty much operates is, you have a cell of between a dozen or 24 people, and they all train together. They have beers together. They go bowling, whatever it is that they want to do. So they all know each other. They know how each other is thinking and everything. And so they're able to operate as a cohesive group. And what I think that you're kind of getting at is really, we need to take a good hard look at this. And perhaps we need to be emulating some of this stuff on the left as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that definitely was where I was going with that. And somewhere else that I was going with that same comment was that these people have been at this for a while. I mean, the Proud Boys were founded in 2016, which means one of the reasons that we might be seeing more violence is that we are seeing the results of these people having trained now for, well over a year in how to engage in combat with people. I mean, they really go through the motions. That, you know, when I was listening to Gavin McInnes talk, I was like, Jesus, this is like stories that I've heard from Special Forces guys. You know, they have certain levels that they have to get to. Some of those levels require, you know, the rest of the club beating the crap out of one member in order to get them up to that level. And then I think the last level that he was talking about, they actually have to get in a fight, get arrested, get in trouble with the police for attacking a leftist.
Yeah, that's the last degree, is they have to get arrested for the cause. He doesn't actually specify how, you just have to get arrested for the cause.
This brings me to a thing that I've been trying to push for a while, just, you know, on a personal front. I'll make Twitter posts about this all the time. I'll talk about this on Facebook and other social media, which is that if you have any interest at all in getting into martial arts to protect yourself, to protect people who you care about, it is very important that you start sooner rather than later. Start looking up schools tonight. It's real easy. And just start calling places and get into some kind of training as soon as possible. It takes a lot of time to develop these skills to the point that they're usable. And that's one thing that people should be thinking. And another thing that people should be thinking about, particularly people who do show up at protests, we need to start showing up in the same type of groups that the Proud Boys do. We tend to, on the left, to operate mostly on an individual basis. So you don't have like a huge group of like 12 people unloading from a bus and getting out and going to the protests like we do with the Proud Boys, like we do with Patriot Prayer. But we should maybe start adopting some of those strategies. It's difficult for us. It's more difficult for leftists to organize. It's more risky to organize. I think that if you set a criteria for people who you're willing to train with, people who you're willing to get together with on a you know, fairly regular basis to do this kind of stuff, you set a criteria. Maybe these are people who you've known prior to 2014 who are all, you know, really good, trustworthy people who you know really well, and see how many of them you can get on board with you to, you know, get together once in a while, talk, hang out, go to protest, engage in activism, but also train together. If you have one thing that's really cool, if you have a group of people going and somebody takes Taekwondo, for example, and you have another person who takes Wing Chun, you have another person who takes BJJ, you can all use all of those different systems and you can learn from each other. You can all be going to completely separate schools and developing similar skills to each other by mixing your knowledge.
Well, the other thing is that by hanging out, by just like doing things that are not training, but as a group, you're having fun, you're building social relationships, you're also working in the community as well. Get together, do a book club thing, have a discussion at a bar or restaurant once a week or every other week or whatever. That's good because you're kind of making your group visible in a way that's friendly towards engagement. But the other thing is that really I think that whatever the red guard answer is, if you want to call it that, whatever we want to call like our answer to this is definitely small cells so that you know everybody that's there and can get to know everybody very well. That way, if there is a problem with somebody, if somebody is problematic, if somebody is acting, you know, like a cop would or something like that, it's easier to identify those behaviors than when you're out on the field at some random protest with 100 other people that you've never really met.
I do want to say one thing, because at the risk of like undoing everyone and taking us down from DEFCON 1, some of us do already do that. The anti-fascists in Phoenix are very tight-knit, and then you have like you just said the Red Guard answer, right? There's Red Guard Austin, and I remember very early on, like one of the first like far-right protests, whatever the group was calling them, so I think it might have been Vanguard America, got off a bus, and there was the Austin Red Guard there with freaking M4s. Would say one of the Nazis tried to grab one of them, and immediately all their rifles like went to their shoulder. You know, it seriously looked like there were going to be shots fired for a minute. So I mean, it's not like we're complete losers.
Well, the problem is we need more of it because we don't have enough of it. We just have a little bit here and there. It's like the salt in a dish, and we need more salt.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I know that there are people out there that are doing a pretty good job of this. I mean, one of the more recent protests that we had here in Seattle, the John Brown Gun Club showed up, and that was really cool to see because those guys just rolled in and they looked like professionals. It was pretty cool. And it did make people in that protest feel a lot more comfortable because the other side was certainly very well armed. Yeah, I mean, just building that culture of that self-defense culture, building those close community ties, that's something that we definitely need a lot more of. It's definitely something that would serve us very well. If I can break a little bit from talking directly about about self-defense, this has been really hard on a lot of people's mental health. And just being able to hang out with a group of people who are all driven by the same goal, interested in the same thing, doing something, getting what psychologists would call a flow mindset going, is very, very good for mental health. And I think that we could all do a little bit more of that lately too.
Well, that's part of the whole point of just getting together, hanging out, having your book club, having your bowling league, whatever it is that your group wants to do. If it's D&D every Saturday night at 8 p.m. at Jim's house or whatever, then by all means do it, because that's bond building. That not only it helps your mental health, but it also just helps you get to know everybody in a way that you can't know everybody just when you're training, because you show a different part of yourself when you're training and everything, that you psychologically front in different social scenarios. It's a very well-known principle. You can be a different person in a different scenario or surrounded by a different group. And if you place yourself in a more social scenario, you're able to figure out how everybody else kind of thinks and jives and what they're comfortable with, what they're not comfortable with. That way, you don't have conflicts of personality, or you're not going to be like, oh, in this particular situation, this person's going to just run out and abandon us, or, those kind of situations aren't as likely to happen when your group is more cohesive and regimented. And that's how you kind of build a lot of discipline within a group. But also, all of this kind of, like you said, ties back to mental health, because everybody needs a break from it. You can't go 24 hours thinking about this stuff, because it will drive you insane. It's a way of just escaping from it, but also bonding with your community as well. And the other thing is of course, like if you do like a bowling league, or if you go out to a bar or whatever, in that case, you're also kind of putting on a community face as well, and people in the community kind of know who you are. And then the third thing that we should also be doing, in addition to mental health, you can't just show up at protests and expect people just root for you because you're beating what is apparently the bad guy's ass, because not everybody might see it that way, or maybe they don't understand why or whatever, or what you're actually fighting for. And so it would really help that leftists need to get involved and active and embedded in their community. There's like a Food Not Bombs organization, or like a food kitchen, that kind of thing. Participate in a community garden, help out your neighbors, make sure that they're okay. That at the core is what leftism is about. It's about the community, and you can't expect the working class as a whole to empathize with you if you're not active out there assisting the working class.
You need your political wing, right? Like, in fact, the tight group of you that goes to the protest that's all ready to haul your Molotovs or whatever. Yeah, that should be small. But when you do the bowling thing, you should have as many people there as you can get, as many coworkers you can bring, and you should be open about being a leftist. Don't just say, I support Bernie Sanders, or, yeah, I'm a liberal. Like, you should be out there. Don't go into the bar with red flags away necessarily, but you should be up front about who and what you are. But you may even want to say, oh yeah, we're Antifa, because that's what everyone knows. Most people probably don't even make the connection that Antifa are communists.
Honestly, I really like that idea. I mean, that would really form some really good optics. I know that that's kind of a controversial term, but I mean, that kind of stuff, just going out into the community and being out about being left and doing things that are going to put a face on the movement that is fun and that is community friendly and that is, builds on a lot of the things that we really do have as strengths is going to be a big part of this too.
Let's say you have a lot of leftists in your group that are really good with auto repair or whatever. So for whatever reason, you go out and you help people that can't afford to fix their cars, no questions asked. Then you do that, and, you you do it as a group and you have all your Antifa stuff out while you're doing it and everything, then all of a sudden it turns into those people in the Proud Boys shirts are kicking these protesters' butt, and I don't know why, but I don't like protesters. Then all of a sudden it becomes, oh wait, that's the guy that fixed my car and they're trying to kick his ass.
It's pretty important to humanize ourselves. It's definitely going to be a helpful thing in the long run. I don't know if that's going to help keep Tiny from kicking you in the face, at a protest, but it's definitely, over the long term, I think, going to make people change their mind about you getting kicked in the face. And in terms of the kicking in the face going on, it would be nice to see that happening to leftists a lot less at these protests. And part of that is going to be, getting together and training with each other, learning how to act cohesively as a group, just as like the Proud Boys have learned how to use group tactics.
And they sound big and overwhelming, but like you said, they have like cells of 12 of them. There might be like 4 cells of 12 in like Portland, or there might be more in Seattle, but when it comes down to it, it's small groups of people. Like, it's not like we are in an arms race and need to produce tanks yet. We could match this pretty easily with some quick work.
In those videos, everything always seems like it's way more dramatic and way bigger than it really is. Typically, like when you're watching one of those videos, the mind kind of wants to fill in everything around the screen and tell you that that's what's happening, for like a mile radius around where the video is being taken. And that's often not the case. Usually at these protests, the instances of violence, they go super quick. Sometimes they're super subtle and they're actually kind of hard to see. It tends to be these little quick interactions. What they tend to do at these things is that they'll come in and they'll have people instigating who are trying to draw people away from the crowd by taunts, by pushing them around or whatever. And then as soon as they get somebody into a position where they can do something, they do something. Somebody will come in and subtly instigate a thing, or wait until there's not that great of a visual on what's going on, and then they spray somebody in the face with pepper spray so that they can say, oh, they obviously attacked me. It is kind of interesting to watch those videos and explore those tactics, and there are a number of really common ones that the Proud Boys use too. That's another thing, is that I think that we could gain a lot from actually watching these videos and really paying attention to the tactics that are working for them. Both because there are some of those tactics that we could be utilizing ourselves, but also because it is kind of important, if you're going into a combat situation, to kind of understand what your enemy is going to do, particularly if they're pretty predictable like the Proud Boys are.
They have like one tactic, and that's just rush forward. Now, they might know more than that. That might be all they need because no one's called them on that yet. But so far as it looks like, they do one thing, and that's rush forward.
Well, from what I've seen is that there's a number of tactics that they use. Like I said, one of them is that they'll send instigators into the crowd. Here in Seattle, what'll tend to happen is that the police will divide up the street, and one side of the street is going to be leftists, and the other side of the street is going to be Patriot Prayer, whatever group is meeting up that's going to be joined by the Proud Boys. And what'll happen is that they'll put people in plain clothes. There'll be a number of them that aren't in those pipe polo shirts, and they'll work their way into your crowd, and they'll look like they aren't doing anything, and then all of a sudden they haul off and hit somebody, or they mace somebody. It's really hard to deal with those kind of tactics because, how do you spot people who aren't, necessarily like a uniformed army? It's just people in clothes. So, how do you know if the person's standing next to you? And that's part of why it's pretty cool to show up with a group of people who you can trust, because at that point you've got like 10 people standing around you who you all know, and if somebody tries to do something and get into that crowd, you know who the outsider is.
The anti-fascists in Phoenix did that to me too at the first rally I showed up at, not the big one where we all got pepper sprayed, but a small little like Black Lives Matter rally, and I walk up with my flag and they give me the 3rd degree, and I knew why. Right? Like, here's someone new, a leftist they haven't seen on the scene before, coming up. How are you doing, fellow kids? Although I hope I was not quite that, green. And they talk to me and they seem okay with me, and I got, so like, that's the kind of stuff that working in a small group allows you to do. When you see how do you do, fellow kids, you know it for what it is. And I obviously was an actual fellow kid, so.
Well, I mean, and that being said, too, something else that I would just kind of caution in terms of getting together with groups is that people who are there to infiltrate you are going to be good at their jobs. It's why they're picked for those jobs generally. So even though you might have a really good feeling about somebody, even if you think you know somebody, I would highly recommend setting up a really stringent and kind of objective criteria for picking who you trust. I mean, kind of one of my big ones is that I'm a little iffy on people who I met, after the election cycle got going. If I knew them before the election cycle got going, I'm pretty good, and I'll talk in pretty good detail about stuff that I engage in. But otherwise, I'll kind of be pretty tight-lipped.
And there's a lot of great resources out there on OPSEC and how to deal with that kind of thing. CrimeThink, which is an anarchist group that started out in Eugene originally, they actually have a great article on OPSEC that's quite detailed. If you ever have a little bit of time and want to wade through it, I highly recommend that. And it recommends on how to do it without also being paranoid as well, which is the other end of that you have to be careful with.
I mean, paranoia, that, getting in looping that back to the self-defense thing, too. I mean, that's a really important thing to think about right now, because it is unfortunately one of those things that serves to kind of break our groups up from the inside like cancer. When you have a whole bunch of people together who really aren't sure about whether or not they should be trusting the people standing next to them, it really does kind of poison that group, and I really do think that that's really kind of affects a lot of different aspects of what we do. And like one of those things would be like at protests, it's like I'd be a little leery about running up to give somebody assistance, because I don't know, maybe that could turn into 3 guys all of a sudden beating on me when I thought it was just 2 guys trying to beat up one. And that, those kind of thoughts can run through your head sometimes, because people who are really clever, who are out there to hurt you, those are sometimes tactics that get employed. It's pretty important, but it's also important that we build that community. And it's really hard. How do you build a community if there's that mistrust there? It's a really important balance.
Right. The first assumption is, oh, this guy's a cop, and then everyone around me is a cop, and then I'm the only one who's not a cop.
Okay, so that's kind of like where the whole point of having the small cells kind of come in, because you get to know everybody and everything, how they think, who they are and everything. Infiltration becomes harder when you're dealing with a group of a dozen people or so that know each other real well versus 30 or 40 people that meet once a month to do.
It kind of brings me to one of the topics that I wanted to talk about, but didn't get to yet. That is a thing called Cooper's levels of awareness. It's a thing that's used by the military and used by police forces to kind of set the mode of behavior and mode of awareness that somebody's going to have in a given space. The modes in Cooper's levels typically goes white, yellow, orange, red, and black. And the way that kind of is described is that white would be like, I'm feeling pretty confident about where I am. I don't feel like I have to pay attention. I'm just sitting here on my phone in my living room. I don't know what's happening in the kitchen. I don't care. Yellow would be the condition that I would recommend just pretty much being in all the time, which is that you're aware of this, you're aware of your surroundings, aware of the people in the surroundings, aware of what you're doing, where you are, which makes it very easy to pick up on things that don't line up and don't make sense. Condition yellow isn't necessarily a condition of permanent paranoia. It's just if you're a Buddhist, it would be kind of considered mindfulness. It would be just a state of awareness that allows you to let your mind pay attention to where you are and what you're doing. And orange would be something has piqued my interest, something is not right, or whatever. Red usually indicates that whatever that thing that drew your attention to level orange is actually presenting some kind of threat, and at that point you should be working through some kind of system to either get yourself away from it or deal with that threat, and black is being under attack.
Right, so basically it's just a flow of the different levels of threat that you're exposed to in any given time.
Well, I wouldn't even necessarily say a threat. Like I said, I mean, I wouldn't consider yellow to be a state of paranoia. I'm in a state of yellow right now, and I'm not, I'm not reaching for a weapon. I don't think that there's anybody here in the room trying to hurt me and my cat. My cat's pretty sketchy. So, but I mean, it really just means that I'm kind of paying attention. If there was a knock at the door right now, I'd be able to be aware of it and respond to it, and I wouldn't be, tuned out in my phone or computer or whatever. I'm sitting here talking to people. And so to state of yellow would mean that I'm paying attention to what you're saying and I'm trying to follow the thread of the conversation, understand what we're talking about. We're not in condition orange even right now.
Right. And then the other thing that you wanted to mention as well was like things that you should not do or weapons that you should avoid as well. We'd have had a previous conversation about that, I believe.
I'm pretty opinionated about weapons, and so I might say some things here that that certain people might disagree with, but there's some reasoning to what I say when I talk about this stuff. So, one of the things that comes up oftentimes in self-defense is that, I've had a number of people, I had at least one really memorable encounter with somebody who was basically like, none of that stuff matters. Whatever you're doing to turning hand to hand, it doesn't matter at all. Get yourself a gun, and that's what's really going to save you in a situation. Get yourself a weapon, a big stick or whatever. My response to that, first of all, was that no, that's not actually true. Not all weapons are created equal. For one thing, in any situation, there are going to be pros and cons to everything that you're carrying. But also that, yeah, absolutely, all the martial arts training that you can do hand to hand will apply in weapons. We have a form in Wing Chun that involves butterfly knives, and we're not talking about the butterfly knives that you pick up at the store at the mall that you flip around in your hand. These butterfly knives are like short swords. They look like machetes. Wing Chun was originally a military art that was designed to kill people. It was designed to train soldiers quickly, and so there were elements of this that did involve weapons. Anyway, that aside, when we do that form, those weapons are treated like parts of our body. We still apply the same principles that we would apply to our hand techniques when using those. If you are using a weapon and you're not applying any sort of techniques, you aren't aware of body mechanics, you can end up perhaps even putting yourself at a disadvantage with it. And so it's really important to think about that as well. Think about what you want to carry, think about how you want to carry it, and think about whether or not you know how to.
One thing I haven't heard talked about yet, and the one thing that always comes up in my mind whenever I decide, do I want this knife in my pocket or whatever? What is more dangerous, going without the weapon or going with the weapon and for whatever reason, not even planning to, let's say you run a red light and you get pulled over or whatever, somehow encountering a cop with that weapon in your possession. That's not how I'd like to go down if I'm going to go down by cop. It being shot because, I happen to have a knife on me and he can come up with an excuse to murder me for fun.
Which kind of comes to the types of weapons that, one might want to carry. I wouldn't advocate carrying anything that's illegal in your area. It's easy usually to find weapons that will work for self-defense that are not illegal to carry in your area. And a lot of the laws are really stupid, and a lot of the cops who are, running beats don't really know those laws. And so it kind of becomes important to you to know that you're carrying. Look up your local laws and you pay attention to what you're buying. Like here in Seattle, for example, it's illegal to carry nunchaku for some weird reason. I mean, I don't know that there were ever roving bands of, nunchaku users causing problems on the street, but I mean, that's illegal, but they didn't make a weapon called a kubotan illegal, which is like a one-sided nunchuck. A kubotan is a weapon that I carry on a daily basis. I have one on a keychain. I love them. It's something to consider. So if you have an ordinance in your area that says no knives over 3 inches, well, find a knife that's 3 inches. 3 inches is a lot of knife. You can do a lot with 3. And so you don't necessarily need to go out and buy a machete to defend yourself. But yeah, carry things that are legal, and definitely be aware of that when talking to cops. I mean, generally, if you're going to go the weapons route, be aware of what you're carrying, where you're carrying it. And, when you do find yourself talking to a cop, I would say that the very first thing that you should do is make your hands visible, calmly explain, hey, officer, I have a knife in my back pocket, or, if you're a CPL, say, I'm a registered concealed carry and I do have my pistol on me. Don't move your hands. Don't make any sudden movements. Maintain eye contact with the officer. But yeah, police tend to get really skeeved by weapons, any talk of weapons, and sometimes it's even dangerous to bring it up. I mean, we saw that with Philando Castile. He was doing literally what I just described and still ended up getting shot. It's pretty dangerous, but I don't know that there's necessarily a way to completely make those interactions safe.
So sometimes it's a damned if you do, damned if you don't scenario, really. I mean, the way that I see it is, as far as likelihood, it really does kind of feel like that right now, given the political climate, it's probably a good idea to have something on you for protection.
In terms of specific weapons that I like and that I don't like. Things that I tend to carry on myself, I will usually have a knife on me. Usually someplace where I can get at it and I don't have to worry about my hand getting. I also highly advocate that if you don't feel like you can dedicate an entire load of time to learning hand-to-hand self-defense, that maybe you do want to go the CPL route. Now, I'm not a huge fan of guns. I am a gun owner and I do carry legally, but there are some issues with gun carry that I don't think necessarily suit it to a whole lot of, aside from very rare circumstances. That being said, guns are really scary, and so if you have one on you, it can be a thing that can save your life. Things that I like are knives, pepper spray. I like guns. And I also like steel batons, if those are legal to carry in your area. Those are really terrifying to deal with.
Talking about the kind that you whip it out and it extends.
Yeah, those are really, really effective. I mean, the thing that I like about batons is that if somebody sticks their hand into your space and they're trying to take that weapon away from you, all you need to do is swing it. It doesn't really matter what it hits. It's going to break whatever bone it hits. Things like mace, I just really love because they're operable at a range. You don't necessarily have to be within the range that somebody could hurt you. The other thing that I really like about mace is that cops pretty much treat mace like they treat someone getting yelled at. Particularly like if you're a woman, if you're small. I gave a can of mace to my partner who is a tiny individual, and I said, look, if somebody yells at you, if somebody makes you feel scared, just whip this out and spray it. You're like 5 foot nothing. And when a cop talks to you, you say that you felt afraid and that you maced them. And they're going to probably let you go when any questions asked. And if they do ask questions, it's probably formality purposes. And it doesn't cause any permanent damage, which is the other reason that I like mace. People tend to hesitate with things that are going to cause really severe permanent sorts of damage like knives or guns. But if you really think about what mace does, I don't think that anybody would hesitate to whip that out and spray somebody if they thought they
maced myself today. I wiped my eyes after cutting a pepper, and that's basically what his mace is pepper juice, essentially. You're giving someone a bad time. So I see what you mean, where it's like you don't hesitate when you know you're not gonna, oh god, am I gonna kill this person?
I used to carry mace regularly, and I would have my hand on that, even if I had somebody just next to me on the bus. Not necessarily thinking like I'm gonna use this, but just thinking, well, there's another human being here. That's kind of a thing to think about too. I mean, if you're gonna draw a gun on somebody and you're gonna hesitate to fire it, I mean, maybe you aren't necessarily somebody who should be carrying a gun. Maybe not the right thing for you. Same thing with a knife. In terms of like brands of mace, the one that I really like is a Saber, a 3-in-1. It's got CS tear gas in it too, and man, I've been exposed to that. And let me just say, in terms of stuff that would be a stopping blow, you spray that on somebody, they're not going to be able to breathe, they're not going to be able to see. You're going to be able to run and get away. It's nasty. It's things that I don't really advocate for necessarily, and that I see a lot of people talk about. I don't like stun guns, and I don't like tasers. Would be the biggest one that I object to. People tend to buy these things thinking that they have some kind of magical properties, like you hit somebody with a taser and they land on the ground convulsing, foaming at the mouth, and it's this whole big deal. I've actually out of curiosity hit myself with a taser, and my experience with it was that it locked up the muscle in my leg for a second. I saw a white flash, but as soon as I let off the trigger, 100% of those effects were gone, and it did hurt, but I don't know that necessarily that would be a stopping blow. There are a lot of other little knickknacks and things that are typically marketed for women's self-defense, cat's eye keychain, other things like that I don't necessarily have super good feelings about, just because a lot of that stuff is very cheaply made. And I don't want to go into a situation with something thinking that it's going to protect my life and the cheapest ABS plastic breaks as soon as. Going with a knife, going with mace, going with a baton or a gun and a CPL is a good way to go.
And all of this stuff actually applies more and more globally, as well as the far right insurgency just spreads from country to country. In Brazil, the far right candidate pretty much won their equivalent to the primaries, or actually it's like a pre-election that they have. But he didn't win enough votes to actually win the election, so they're going to have a runoff. He got 46% of the vote, and this guy, he's pretty much a fascist in the classical sense of the word.
I think it's Bolsonaro.
So his name's Jair Bolsonaro. He won 46% of the vote, like I said. He's with a party ironically called the Social Liberal Party, if you want to wrap your brain around that. And his opponent only got 29% of the vote. And the only way that he can really mathematically win this election is if the minor left voters and all the minor right voters vote for his opponent, which is Fernando Haddad.
The guy is terrifying. Everything that I've read about him and everything that I've seen, I don't even know how I would feel if I lived.
I'd imagine it must be absolutely terrifying, not just for leftists in Brazil, but just minorities, LGBTQ individuals, just anybody that would have any reason to have to hide something from the government at this point, or that was even just a little bit to the left. I'd be very nervous because some of his positions are just so extreme. Not only did he praise the former Brazilian military dictatorship, which ruled from 1964 to 1985, in 2015, he actually said that if he ever became president, he was going to install a military coup on his first day. He's also promised police bonuses for just killing criminals in the street. So not apprehending criminals for trial, just actually going out and just shooting criminals on the street. He's a fan of Pinochet, and he actually said that Pinochet should have killed more people. He told a female congressman that he wouldn't rape her because she wasn't good enough. He's absolutely just an abhorrent and disgusting person. He believes that the poor should be sterilized, so should the descendants of slaves in the country. It's gross. He has this huge upswelling of just extreme far right people in Brazil supporting him right now, and it very much harkens back to kind of what we saw with Trump. But another thing that I actually noticed does anybody get deja vu from this? Like they've seen this candidate before?
I mean, some of the stuff that he is wanting, I mean, specifically that cops just going out and shooting people, it definitely reminds me.
Yeah, just the whole military dictatorship, the cops shooting people in the street, even his position on LGBTQ. It's Duterte again. It really feels like there are some similar conditions. I mean, there's not really a revolutionary army marching around Brazil right now. At least not to my knowledge. I know that there is in the Philippines, and that's part of why Duterte was able to come to power. But just rhetorically, he sounds a lot like him, and it's very scary. We have all these people in America as well that are supporting this guy, and the support is absolutely disgusting. I don't know if you guys saw it. You know that there is a freaking game on Steam dedicated to this guy?
What, just video games need to end. And that's what I'm going to say before I go into a rant about games of gamers. Eerily, with the Deja Vu 2, it's very similar to what happened here with Bernie Sanders, except it involved actual guns, police, and prison, because there was a candidate, and I think he had actually been the president of Brazil before. His name was one of those 5-name long Spanish names.
Oh, you're talking about Lula da Silva. Yeah.
Right. So he's basically a social democrat. I mean, probably, honestly, a leftist, but in South America, social democracy is the limit, or the United States comes and, bombs you or, overthrows your government. So, a social democrat, but probably knows more about leftism than that. So, they come up with all these stupid charges, the worst of which was, he took a house as a gift and he doesn't actually live in it. Something like that. Something that, U.S. politicians do brazenly and brag about.
So they were never actually able to prove that there was any wrongdoing in that whole ordeal either?
Right, it didn't matter. They said it, and that's what stuck in people's minds, and that they just said it is all they needed to go about trying to round him up. So Lula and the workers, well, really the workers take Lula and they stash him in a factory, and they surround the factory with guns to protect him. And they're literally willing to like shoot out with the police to protect him. And Lula does the stupid thing of saying, no, I don't want violence. And he walks out and gets arrested. He should have at least been smuggled out and gone into exile, right? At least not give them the victory of jailing him. You know, if not legit, just go to the mountains and start the damn revolution. But so now Lula's in jail, and the person in the opposition party, which was Lula's party, is now basically running on a platform of freeing Lula from jail and not talking about the other issues. Similar to how here we had a strong social democrat who was everyone's favorite and everyone knew it was going to win, and then they got rid of him and then stopped talking about the actual issue.
It's funny that, well, it's terrifying actually that a lot of the right wing's tactics in so many places has seemed to have been, stopping progress in its tracks and kind of putting the left on a permanently defensive posture. It's been really, really rough for us to recover. It's just really, really sickening that seems to have been as a successful strategy as it has been. In this case, stopping a discussion on issues to basically force somebody to run on a platform of freeing the person who should be running from jail. That is driven to kind of an extreme.
They're masters of distraction, among other things. One thing that I did want to point out in all of this was, and it is really to no surprise, American interest groups have been behind this whole election the entire time.
You mean like in the way we always are? Like making their politicians we don't like disappear?
Not necessarily that, but there was some of that with like Lula, for instance. But this whole right-wing upswell in Brazil happened under foundations that were created by the Koch brothers. Essentially what happened is that the Koch brothers created two organizations. So the first one was Students for Liberty, and this was basically college students, and I think maybe some whatever their equivalent to high school students are as well. They were a political organization, and essentially what they did was spread libertarian propaganda on campuses. From there, it kind of just led from one thing to another. But what was going on here was that all of the major figures of Students for Liberty were actually being flown out to the United States, and they were being given personalized training from the Cato Institute, and also they would meet up with people like Rand Paul in the United States and have meetings with they would have meetings with important conservative figureheads in the United States, and of course get all of this training from these organizations. And then what eventually happened here is that kind of set up the conditions for, after these students graduated, they created a second organization that was also funded by the Kochs, and that was called the Free Brazil Movement, which basically consisted of alumni of the Students of Liberty and then other people that they were able to kind of suck in. The Free Brazil Movement was like a lot of different things. So one thing that they did was they created like a ton of like fake news organizations, and they propagated all this information on hundreds of Twitter pages, of which like 200 were recently shut down for spreading fake news. And they were basically spreading fascistic screeds and tirades against the gays and immigrants and the Afro-Brazilians and all of the people that you would imagine. But the second thing that the Free Brazilian movement did is they created their own like brown shirts, and a lot of the leaders are surrounded by essentially what are literal neo-Nazi bodyguards and gangs. And these bodyguards and gangs are also known for not only just like protecting the leaders, but they'll also like go to protests, kind of like the Proud Boys do, and harass protesters. But they've also just showed up at public schools and harass teachers that are teaching things that they don't like. So that kind of shows like where this could go to in the United States if we don't put a lid on this, because a lot of their tactics, like Fred said, are very similar.
Do you remember that scene in Austin Powers where number 2 says, "There are no countries anymore, just corporations"? You just reminded me of that pretty hardcore.
Oh, yes. I do remember that particular quote. In fact, I actually love that movie. That's just one of my favorite cheesy sit-down movies that I like to watch from time to time. So I know that movie very well. It's a guilty pleasure. What can I say?
Oh, behave.
Gah, baby, gah! Yeah, no, we're not gonna do that. Not the rest of the episode.
No.
But
No.
Well, Austin Powers is like, he should be an honorable furry thing.
What? Okay, do the episode.
One of the things that I did want to point out, though, is while looking up all this information on the Koch brothers, the foundations that were involved, the whole like Free Brazil movement, like that's actually tied into an even larger organization called the Atlas Foundation. And that's actually the particular Koch brother foundation that's funding all of this. But they fund various organizations all over South America. And they also have connections to, no surprisingly, things like the School of Americas, which if you don't know what that is, then you don't know Latin American history, and you need to look up the School of Americas before even discussing modern history in Latin America, because that's where so many of these counter-revolutionaries were trained out of. Trying to just spot this information was so difficult because Google essentially doesn't throw this information up. I actually had to use DuckDuckGo, and this is not an advertisement for DuckDuckGo. This is an anti-advertisement for Google, that if you're doing any kind of research and you're running into these topics, you'll often find that Google just doesn't show anything up. Like if you type in Atlas Foundation and Bolsonaro, almost nothing comes up. You type it into DuckDuckGo, you get a good page or two of hits. I mean, there's not a lot out there, but you still actually get hits. And this is a huge problem that we're facing here, not only with Google, but with Facebook, that they were recently censored, and of course, we kind of saw this like with the whole like Alex Jones things. Of course, it was predictable that they were going to censor the left, and now they are like full throttle. Facebook and Twitter both shut down the anti-media's page based off of information from Proper Not, which is basically a organization that goes out there and they blacklist various media groups and then encourage places like Facebook and Twitter to go out and block these accounts. And some of these accounts, they're legit organizations, like Glenn Greenwald's The Intercept was on this list, for instance. And
The Intercept?
The Intercept?
God. I mean, I could see like them going for WikiLeaks, because that's obviously been politicized. World Socialist website, okay, yeah, that's communist, evil. Consortium, never heard of them.
Global Research, I mean, of course I could see that, because they do kind of get conspiratorial at times, and they do have a little bit of a right bent, but they're not extreme, I would say. Alternet, definitely left-wing independent journalism. Counterpunch, known for left-wing independent journalism. And Truth Out, of course, all of which feature people like Chris Hedges in a lot of their work and other various interesting writers. And so it's not to say that it was, it wasn't predicted that this would happen. But what this really goes to show is that leftists need to approach things like Facebook and Twitter in a more careful manner. Like, this is not really the platform to disseminate information off of, simply because it is going to be censored. I mean, I'm not saying that we shouldn't try, but I'm saying that really we need to build our base with open source platforms. And I say this like I've said this like 3 shows in a row, but
I smell a plug coming.
Right. We need to be on Mastodon. We need to be on Diaspora. We need to be on Friendica, because these particular systems are open source. They scale. They're able to have multiple instances, so you can't just shut down one. And then you combine that with using a search engine that's not Google and not Bing, that's going to censor your results. And we're able to disseminate information better. It makes researching these kind of things easier as well, because that's what we're facing now. We're facing a situation where very soon all this artificial intelligence that's driving Google to filter this out is just going to make it nigh impossible. Or nay? Am I turning into a horse? Nigh impossible to do any real research about who's funding our politicians or who's funding these political movements that are going on.
You know, having listened to your last show, I did like a lot of what you had to say regarding the direction that we should be taking with how we can... I had a question for you. For those of us who are less tech savvy, what are some of the things that are easy to do? Like, what would some resources you could recommend be? Or, some very simple sorts of... basically, where would you recommend somebody learn how to do this stuff who's not really a computer hobbyist?
I would definitely recommend, if you're just starting... maybe get involved with some of those like minor social networks first, because the more the merrier on those platforms. We need people on those platforms. Furries have done a great job of jumping over to Mastodon. Like you go over to Mastodon and like it's leftists and furries, and it's a good time all over. There's a lot of techies there as well. Now, in terms of getting into what you can do as far as like educating yourself tech-wise, that's gonna be a show that's dedicated. It's a long conversation, and I would really like to do that justice to our listeners. So I'd really recommend we approach that on a different episode. Maybe we dedicate a whole episode to like a topic like encryption or like Linux, or, being able to cover your tracks online, that kind of thing.
Honestly, I personally would really appreciate that. I'm not alone.
But just another story that I wanted to kind of get to as well here before we go for tonight was the whole Amazon thing. And I know that, Fretz, you got opinions about Amazon, right?
I have a roommate who works at one Amazon warehouse, and I just get so damn angry every time he starts telling me work stories. Like, it is just very difficult not to just... Like, it just ruins my mood for like hours. He'll tell me about people getting thrown under the bus there. He'll talk about the risk trackers and stuff like that. His most recent piece of news from them was that he was actually one of the unfortunate people who ended up taking a pay cut because at the point that he was only a quarter away from 15 anyway, and of course slashed all of the other benefits, which were kind of the imaginary sort of like stock benefits things that don't really actually matter to most people. And like the stock option thing that he was telling me, that also really got me angry, because the thing is that they give you I forget what he called it, like a provisional stock or something. They give you a stock, but you don't really have the stock until you're vested, and you're not vested until like 2 years of employment. It's really like a carrot on a stick kind of just BS that just drives that kind of work environment.
The fact that they raised the minimum wage and then they went in and they took away all the bonuses and the incentive bonuses as well. Like, if you do a good job and everything, you'll get whatever bonus we assign for doing the job in a certain manner. None of that surprises me, because like it's all stuff that you really just expect from Amazon, and just from reading about the culture and just like even like the management team, like the blue collar, or not the blue collar, the white collar section of Amazon, where they hold meetings and everything, it gets pretty crazy. Like, they're encouraged to just tear into each other's ideas and sabotage each other.
I have a number of friends who work for Amazon, and they work at different levels, and so this is a story that I get to hear from people who I know who work there and are on a tech portion of that business. It sounds just like a Mad Max hellscape in there. Like, they're just trying to really drive this social Darwinism concept that the right just fetishizes to an extreme, to the point that they're creating a work environment that's just extremely toxic. I do not know how somebody would... My roommate came up to me just yesterday and said, "Hey, we got an opening if you know anybody looking." And I looked at him and I said, I would sooner recommend self-immolation than working where you...
Have you told your roommate the Gospel of St. Mark's yet?
Oh, believe me, I have tried. I mean, you hear me talking here. I basically go on rants here all the time regarding this stuff, and whenever he talks about this stuff, I'm just like, well, you could be doing this. Here's this organization that you could call if you wanted to pursue this. But unfortunately, the other part of this strategy with these corporations is one of demoralization. If you keep your workers depressed, stressed out, tired, they're not going to be people who are capable of really fighting back. Everybody's just going to kind of go, oh well, I know that that's illegal to do, or I know that that's completely unethical or whatever, but I just don't have the energy to resist it.
They tried that too. Like, we really are right back in the 20s. Like, in the 20s, before there was any kind of union law, before, when the idea of breaking up monopolies was, ooh, that's scary. I mean, in a way, today that's also controversial, but for different reasons. Workers still did it. Workers still got their stuff together, and they went on strike. And whole neighborhoods went on strike because, they all lived in the same apartment blocks and all worked at the same place. And it's coming to that again, right? Like, all of the apartment complexes around the one Amazon warehouse all work at Amazon. Workers are going to rebel no matter how tired they are.
I would agree. It's just a matter of how bad does it have to get given the set of circumstances. And one of the set of circumstances we deal with here in Seattle is the cost of housing. In the time that I have lived here, the cost of living has just skyrocketed. I run a small business, not even a small business. I'm a one-person business, basically. That's how I make my living. My favorite business story to tell is that when the minimum wage here shot up to 15, and it didn't actually shoot up to 15. That's a poor way of describing it, because basically what happened was we won the fight for 15, I guess. But the deal was that we weren't going up to 15 until the end of the decade. But everybody got a pay raise. The thing that I noticed was that I had more people coming in for my services during that time, because people in the demographics that I typically service were able to afford those services. So business was really good for a little while, but then the landlords happened. And at the end of that year, at one good year, and then at the end of that year, everybody's rent shot up ridiculously. So our rent personally at our old place went up $400 in one go. I had a friend of mine whose rent went up $800. And so landlords just smelled blood, and they came out of the woodwork to just make everybody's lives lead everybody. We also live in a fairly expensive state for taxes. Our tax structure here is extremely regressive. It's very expensive to be poor. If you're poor, you end up paying way more percentage of tax just for living, like car tabs and buying necessities for the house, etc., and things like that. It's pretty expensive to live here, and so part of the thing that I think keeps workers down in places like Amazon is that I think that threshold is set a little bit higher in terms of when people are really going to start taking action, because there's just simply more of a risk. If you go on strike here, there is a possibility that if you aren't joined with the rest, you're going to end up being in one of the tent cities that cleared out here, which is another problem. Every mayor that we've had here for the last has been just really rough on the homeless population. And right now people get swept off the streets and their stuff and people who are on the street homeless right now are people who used to be employed. These are people who used to work at Starbucks. I mean, it's no longer just people who are mentally ill, people who are addicts. This is becoming a problem that even middle class kids.
Well, I mean, as far as landlords go, if I may make the joke, Mao did have a solution for that.
Yeah, but you need the party, and you need the cadres, and you need the revolution to be happening. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's coming. People just outright rebelling against those rents is coming, because the wages are only going to be worth less and less, and the rents are going to be more and more. There's no way that this isn't building to a general strike. It's not even a problem of one producer, one company being able to be fought against. Like, you have to fight against the whole class. I mean, that's basic Marxism. And I don't see how a general strike is not in the future.
There are some books that I'd like to recommend for interested looking into some of the stuff that I talked about a little more in depth. Those books would be Art of War by Sun Tzu. If you are an activist, if you are interested in really fighting and learning some strategies that work, The Art of War by Sun Tzu is I would say just 101. We're going to fight. It's a very good book to read. Another book with regards to personal self-defense that I basically recommend every single person. I think every single person should read this book, especially people in targeted communities, especially people in the kink scene, and especially women, is The Gift of Fear. The Gift of Fear is available on YouTube, I believe, for free, as is The Art of War. The Gift of Fear is a wonderful book for talking about survival signals, talking about things that you can be aware of in your surroundings and in people that will make you a lot safer. And two more books that I would recommend, and these are also, at least one of these is free on YouTube, and I think the other ones as well, is two books by Daniel Goleman, a wonderful psychologist, wonderful writer, called Emotional Intelligence. This is a book that will help people going through the struggles that we're going through right now kind of make more sense of the internal turmoil some of us are through right now. And this does reflect back to self-defense. Training that stillness of the mind is an important aspect of being able to handle yourself coolly in these situations. In particular, one of the things that Daniel Goleman talks about in that book called an amygdala hijack, something that people in general should be very important. The last book here that I have to recommend called Social Intelligence. You are in any kind of talking type activity. You're on social media, you're face to face with very, very good for picking up signal and strategies you can use to kind of socially engineer those situations in cases of self-defense, in cases like in protests that could actually be your life. I think that building solidarity, meet up with your groups of friends, keep everybody in your local circle supported, keep yourself supported. Learn the things that you're going to need to take responsibility for your own safety and your own well-being and well-being. Be that person who can give a little bit out of if you have it at all in you.
Well, I got nothing on that.
And on that note, I think we're going to end it here for tonight. Been a little bit of a long show here. We don't usually go this long, but all this stuff is very important. If you all like listening to our show, you love this show in particular, or any of our material, definitely like, comment, subscribe, share it around, spread it, all that good stuff. If you want to get in touch with the show, we are on Twitter, ironically, even though I said to get on Mastodon. We are at Enceladus1, and you can reach any of the hosts or any of our guests, and we'll forward a message there if we have to. I personally am at Kitsune Flame at twitter.com and also at mastodon.social. And Hemsfox, what's your socials?
My Twitter is at Hemsfox, and I don't have Facebook because I'm a good leftist. And that's pretty much all I use.
Oh man, you got to get on Mastodon. I thought you were going to get on Snouts Online last week. What happened to that?
Snouts, a woo space. I can't keep track of them.
It's Snouts.
About Mastodon. It's just it's Snots. It's Snots now.
It's Snouts. Yeah, that's where everybody's going.
I make my own instance. If I make my own instance, it's just me.
You can. You can totally do that. And Fred,
really?
What about you?
Well, to be honest, I kind of tend to reserve my social media to mostly friends, but I do have a locked Twitter account. I post some self-defense stuff there. But to be honest, I kind of go on a lot of personal rants about client and stuff, so I don't know that anybody want to follow me. But my handle basically everywhere is Frets Makes Music. And if you want to look me up on any furry sites, I'm also on Twitter. I'm around.
And with that, we leave you here tonight. Good night and good luck.